For more than 2,000 years, Jews lived in Europe, where they developed a new language and built religious and educational centers. Wherever they lived, in Spain, France, England, in Holland and the German states, and later in Poland and Russia, the Jews established roots and made a valuable contribution to their host country. Jewish experience always reflected the ebb and flow of European history. Jews began to move from west to east when the Crusaders attacked them as infidels and annihilated many en route to the Holy Land. Ghetto segregation began in the 15th century. By the 18th century, more than 2 million Jews were living in Poland and neighboring lands. Here, too, there was no immunity from persecution, but there was a great cultural renaissance. Its stronghold was the shtetl, the village home of many Jews. In the shtetl, Yiddish was Mamaloshen, the mother tongue, a primary creation of the European experience. Hebrew was Loshen Kodesh, the sacred tongue of scholarship and prayer in the Beth HaMidrash, the synagogue and house of study. Shtetl Jews were artisans. They were innkeepers and peddlers, farmers, scholars, and rabbis. In the second half of the 18th century, Poland was partitioned, and most of the Jews came under the rule of the Russian Tsar. His decree in 1791 restricted the Jews to the Pale of Settlement, a territorial ghetto. By the 1860s, legal restrictions gave way to the repression of Eastern Europe. Canada was a haven of freedom. The earliest Jewish settlers came to Canada in 1760, after the British victory over France in the 7 Years' War. In 1832, the Assembly of Lower Canada proclaimed an act granting equal rights to its Jews, then numbering only 107. More Jews began to enter Canada after 1850. When the SS Pacific docked at Victoria, Vancouver Island, in July 1858, Frank Sylvester, one of the 1,200 passengers, was the first recorded Jewish arrival on the Pacific coast. And in Manitoba, the Koblenz brothers and Reuben Goldstein were the first recorded arrivals in 1877 and 78. Back in Russia, the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in March 1881 was the signal for a wave of pogroms. 215 Jewish communities were attacked, and in 2 years, 100,000 became homeless. A large-scale flight to the New World began. The Russian persecution was protested in many world centers. The Lord Mayor of London called a meeting at the Mansion House. Among the eminent persons present were Sir Alexander Galt, Canada's first High Commissioner to Britain, and several members of the Rothschild family. He wrote Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald of his intentions. The Jewish persecution in Russia has induced me to write Rothschild to discuss the feasibility of removing the agricultural Jews to Canada. When the opportunity for land settlement was explained to them, many of the refugees seized upon the idea with high hopes. On May 26, 1882, 19 weary travelers arrived in Winnipeg. They were soon followed by another 200 refugees, but the promised arrangement for land had not been made. 37 of the men worked all that first night unloading lumber from a river steamer for 25 cents an hour. That summer, 150 of the men went to work for the CPR, laying track to Medicine Hat. But immigration agents considered it a great drawback that they do not speak the English language and that they will not work on Saturday, it being their Sabbath. Among those who arrived in Winnipeg before 1882, Philip Brown and A.V. Koblenz were established as merchant tailors. George Frankfurter was selling dry goods and furs. William Harris was a bookkeeper. The Ripstein brothers were in the grocery business. Louis Wertheim had a cigar store on Main Street. Victor Victorson was a real estate agent, and Elias Tapper was a tailor. These people shouldered the burden of aid to the newcomers. The first concern was Parnosa, earning a living to support their families and assist relatives left behind in Europe. In 1884, Sir Alexander Galt was still seeking land for the Jews. At long last, the government assigned a district near Moosomin, beyond the Manitoba border. But by then, only 27 would-be farmers were left to make the journey. This first Jewish homestead settlement was called New Jerusalem by non-Jewish neighbors. Early frost, hail at harvest time, drought, and severe winters, combined with lack of experience and little guidance, made it impossible for the Jewish homesteaders to continue. By 1888, Galt declared the Moosomin colony a failure and called the Jews vagabonds because they turned to peddling. These vagabonds, such as the Wiedmans, the Lexiers, and the Narovlanskys, became established in various occupations, helped to found synagogues and community institutions, and aided later immigrants to make a better start. Despite early failures, another homestead group started in 1888 near Wapella, just 20 miles west of Moosomin. Led by Abraham Klenman and Solomon Barish, some 40 families settled during the next 5 years. By 1888, the Hirsch Paul and Moses Goldstein families were homesteading at Niverville, Manitoba. At Oxbow in Assiniboia, the Pierce and Wasserman families had settled. In 1889, Akil Bronfman started out at Wapella. He soon moved on to Brandon and Winnipeg. New troubles in Europe in 1891 increased Jewish immigration to Canada. Suddenly that year, 20,000 Jews were ordered to leave Moscow. The Young Men's Hebrew Benevolent Society of Montreal began to plan a new farm settlement in the West. They appealed to the Baron Maurice de Hirsch, founder of the Jewish Colonization Association in Europe. That spring, a settlement location was chosen a few miles from Oxbow. This was to become the Hirsch Colony, where some 49 newcomers settled in May 1892. In spite of hardships, a hardy nucleus stayed on. A few years later, Marcus Berner, a rabbi who wanted to farm, arrived at Hirsch. For over a decade, this became the center of Jewish settlement. In 1899, a westward exodus of Jews began from Romania. The Jewish Colonization Association hoped that another farm settlement might be started in western Canada. The authorities opposed the idea, but later relented, and a new settlement was established at Lipton. In 1903, Bender Hamlet in the Interlake District was the first group settlement in Manitoba, with other settlers farming at Camper, Birds Hill, Lorette, and Pine Ridge. Further west, the Podursky family homesteaded north of Lacombe, Alberta. Settlements were founded in the Rumsey-Trochu district in southern Alberta and Montefiore near the town of Mulbach. Among the more successful farmers were Israel and Mayer Hofer, who graduated from the Jewish Agricultural School in Austria. In 1907, the Hoffers and others founded the Sonnenfeld colony in Saskatchewan, 50 miles west of Estevan. Further north, another Jewish settlement, Eaton Bridge, started in 1906 on the banks of the Carrot River, 25 miles from Melfort. The pioneers wanted to call it the Jewish Bridge, but feared the postal authorities would not approve. So they compromised with Eden Bridge, because Eden was their own word for Jews. The search for Parnassa, a livelihood, led the Jews to many occupations. Victoria, 1860. Several business houses were founded on Yates Street. 1862. Charles Oppenheimer, contractor, built part of the Caribou Wagon Trail, the first road in the BC interior. In the late 1870s in the West, some started as peddlers, later becoming storekeepers. The Jewish General Store became a landmark in many a small town. Rosner and Brownstones at Plum Coulee, Ratner's at Vanguard, others at Limerick and Kelleher, Saskatchewan, and at Trochu in Alberta. Isidore Director and N.B. Cohen were in business in Prince George in 1908. In Winnipeg, many Jews became factory workers. Solly Schwartzman was employed by Cameron Tailors. And there were Jewish workers at the CPR and CNR shops. Some Jews became market gardeners, selling their produce at Moroznik's farmers market. Others became dairy farmers and milkmen. Sam Polinsky opened a machine shop. Friedman and Dribbin, a furniture factory. A. Gutnik worked on a cattle ranch near Lethbridge. Some worked at the Eureka Brickworks in Estevan in 1908. And Chaim Freighton collected scrap metal in Moose Jaw. Louis Ripstein was fur trading at Prince Rupert in 1910. A year later, Adolph Robinson and George Salmon organized a 500-mile auto trip from Vancouver to Fort Fraser to promote a land development project. In 1918, Ben Grossman chauffeured the Prince of Wales in Victoria, and Nathan Rothstein opened a movie house at Assiniboia, Saskatchewan. The first religious routes in the West were on the Pacific coast. In 1859, the Jews of Victoria established a cemetery, and in June 1863, the cornerstone was laid for the Congregation Emmanuel of Victoria. In Winnipeg, the earliest religious service was held in a private home on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, 1879. Regular Sabbath observance began with the arrival of the Russian immigrants. The first synagogue, Sharizatic, was built in 1889. The Rosh Hashanah followed in 1893, when the Jewish population was only 650. The Romanian Jewish homesteaders at Lipton gathered for a special Thanksgiving service soon after their arrival in 1901. In the small towns and settlements, wherever there were 10 Jews for a minyan, or prayer quorum, a congregation was established with one of the members serving as Baal Tefillah, or prayer leader. Religious observance also meant kashrut, orthodox dietary rules. By now, Winnipeg's Jewish population had grown to 1,200. An Orthodox element built their own synagogue, the House of Jacob. Rabbi Israel Kahanovich, Polish-born and trained, arrived in Winnipeg in 1906 to become its spiritual leader. He was proclaimed chief rabbi and served Winnipeg and the West for 40 years. The synagogue was the center of all community life. The Shari Shomayim Synagogue in Fort William, the B'nai Israel in Brandon, synagogues in Moose Jaw, Melfort, Prince Albert, Medicine Hat, Lethbridge, and Vegreville followed. The Agudath Israel Synagogue, with Moses Selchenko as rabbi, in Saskatoon, and the Regina Beth Jacob Synagogue were all completed by 1913. The Diamond Brothers founded the first synagogues in Edmonton and Calgary. While in Vancouver, small beginnings led to the larger Sharizatic congregation under the leadership of Rabbi Nathan Pastinsky. From the day of their arrival, Russian Jews wanted to give their children a religious education and to establish their own schools. Earlier arrivals had arranged for Hebrew instruction by a melamed, or itinerant teacher. In 1884, the first Cheder, an old country-style private school, was opened in Winnipeg with an enrollment of 12 students. The Sharizatic Hebrew School was established in 1891. It was the first of several schools that led to the opening of the Talmud Torah Hebrew Free School in 1913 at Flora and Charles. After 1905, a Yiddish-speaking socialist group started its own cultural organization. In 1914, they established the National Radical School. This became the I.L. Peretz School. Its curriculum at that time emphasized the Yiddish language, literature, and history. It was here they learned of Peretz and Sholem Aleichem, Avrom Rezen, and Dr. Chaim Zhitlovsky. Thus, a bridge was formed between the cultural riches of the past and the mundane realities of the new world. In 1919, the young women of the Mutter Verein pioneered the first Jewish kindergarten. A year later, they started the first day school class. Later, a more radical element separated from the Peretz School. They organized the Liberty Temple and started a socialist Sunday school, which became the Arbeiter Ring, or Workman's Circle School. In small centers, education was a problem. They required enough students to justify government support, and in addition, had to provide for Jewish education. Wapella had its own public schools as early as 1896. For Hebrew, Abraham Klenman became the teacher. Louis Rosenberg arrived from England in 1915 to become principal and teacher at the Tiferes Israel School at Lipton. Country schools flourished at Hirsch, Bender Hamlet, at Hoffer, and Eaton Bridge. Edmonton established a Hebrew school in 1906 with H. Goldstick as the first teacher. Between 1912 and 1915, Hebrew schools were opened in Calgary, Regina, and Saskatoon. Calgary also established a Yiddish language Peretz school. The minimum objective of any Hebrew education program was to prepare boys to become bar mitzvah at the age of 13. The focal point of the bar mitzvah ceremony is when the young man is called to the reading of the Torah. The most joyous family event is a wedding celebration. The marriage ceremony took place in the synagogue, in the home, or according to the most orthodox custom, out of doors. They received the rabbi's blessing and the ketubah, the traditional marriage contract, often beautifully inscribed in ancient Aramaic or sometimes handwritten in Hebrew. Immigrant aid was the first organized charitable work undertaken by the Jews in Canada. After the turn of the century, many newcomers formed their own self-help groups. The Landsmannschaften were usually associations of immigrants from the same old country town or district. Some, like the Hebrew Sick Benefit Society, formed in 1906, had a broader base. Others had an ideological base, like the Workman's Circle and the Zion Loan Association. By 1909, poverty among immigrants led to the formation of the United Hebrew Charities. In the next decade, the Jewish Home for the Aged was opened, followed by the Western Canada Orphanage and a free Jewish dispensary, forerunner of the Mount Carmel Clinic. B'nai B'rith, the oldest Jewish fraternal order in the world, established the first Winnipeg Lodge in 1909, followed by lodges in other western cities. The Zionist Movement, started in Europe in the late 19th century for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, reached the West in 1899. By 1914, local societies were active from Fort William to Vancouver. In 1917, the 15th National Convention of the Canadian Zionist Federation took place in Winnipeg, with 306 delegates from all over the country. The growth of Jewish life in Western Canada continued during the First World War. Jews who had been coming to Canada for 30 years with European help now were able to repay their debt by helping their kin in the war-torn countries of Europe. Jews served in the armed forces on many fronts in both wars. By 1915, the Western Jewish Fund for the Relief of War Sufferers, headed by Marcus Hyman of Winnipeg, was flourishing. Contributions were raised in small towns and large cities across the prairies. The conditions of World War I gave impetus to a movement for a World Jewish Congress to defend the rights of Jews in every country. The idea was vigorously debated throughout Canada. In the summer of 1916, a Western Jewish Conference was held in Winnipeg and called for the establishment of a Jewish Congress in Canada. The West sent 43 delegates. The war upheaval in Europe had caused an increase in refugees, while Canadian immigration laws became more restrictive. The first Canadian Jewish Congress decided to establish an immigrant aid society with branches in every port of entry and in every community. By this time, organized Jewish life was flourishing in large and small centers across the West. Literary and dramatic societies and varied ideological movements were widespread. Jews took part in social and festive events, and many were active in sports. Selim Franklin, the first Jew in political office in the West, entered the legislature of Vancouver Island in 1860. And in 1871, Henry Nathan of Victoria was the first Jew elected to the House of Commons. In Winnipeg, Moses Finkelstein was an alderman by 1904, and S. Hart Green was elected to the Manitoba legislature in 1910. Later, others served on school boards, city councils, provincial legislatures, and in the federal parliament. Eventually, some became cabinet ministers and leaders of political parties. While some graduated from universities as doctors, lawyers, teachers, architects, others worked in factories, helped to organize trade unions, and were active in business. By the 1930s, ugly rumblings came out of Germany with the rise of Hitler's fascism. Strong efforts were made to combat Nazi influence and to save refugees. In World War II, the first Jews from Western Canada enlisted in September 1939. The Holocaust of World War II annihilated 6 million Jews and demonstrated the depths of man's inhumanity to man. The incredible uprising of the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943 against inevitable destruction has become a symbol of the heroism of which man is capable. The Lodz Ghetto experience is another episode of human resistance that will be recorded in the annals of mankind. 1/3 of the 40,000 Jews who now live in Western Canada are survivors. They came here as war orphans, as remnants of human beings, to rebuild their lives in a free society with the help of relatives, friends, and community agencies. The Jewish people in Canada today number some 275,000. The individual Jew may be in the public eye when he is a judge, a cabinet minister, a university president, a mayor, a symphony orchestra conductor, or a popular novelist or poet. For every prominent personality, however, there are many more who fulfill their responsibilities as salesmen, barbers, doctors, cab drivers, lawyers, electricians, or storekeepers. Just as other groups have links with their homelands, most Jews have a natural affinity for Israel with its religious, cultural, and historical connotations. This, then, is a saga of a people in despair and in hope, at home and at work, in schools and in synagogues. How they lived, prayed, worked, played, and celebrated. How they faced near annihilation and were reborn. A people who kept alive the religious and cultural values developed over many centuries for more than 200 years, and continue to make a contribution to the rich, many-faceted pattern of Canada today.
la 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 la